Good morning, and we are in a new week, and we're studying studying Doctrine and Covenants 71 through 75. No weapon is formed against you that shall prosper. It's got to be good, comforting advice on that. So, ever since he was a boy, Joseph Smith faced critics, even enemies, and he tried to do God's work, but it must have been particularly difficult in late 1831 when Ezra Booth began publicly berating the church because in this case the critic was a former believer. Ezra had seen Joseph use God's power to heal a woman. He had been invited to accompany Joseph on the first survey of the land of Zion in Missouri. He had since lost his faith and, in an attempt to discredit the prophet, published a series of letters in an Ohio newspaper. And his efforts seemed to be working because unfriendly feelings had developed against the church in the area. What should believers do in a case like that? While there is no right answer for every situation, it seems that often, including in this case in 1831, part of the Lord's answer is to declare the truth and correct falsehoods by proclaiming the gospel. Yes, the Lord's work will always have critics, but in the end, no weapon is formed against it and shall prosper. So we have here a pattern that has been followed since the beginning, and that is that when we have critics, and we have critics of the church a lot, and in this time and day, in Ezra, and that, let's put it in this perspective. In that time, Ezra Booth produced something that, especially in Kirtland area, was probably consumed quickly. Think about Kirtland. Kirtland was a quiet place with some religious desires. You had communities. You had Sidney Rigdon preaching there, and several other people who had good congregations there. But then here comes this word of this new church by Joseph Smith. And remember, Ezra Booth himself was a minister. And so here he is, here's Kirtland, and there's all this excitement because there's hundreds and soon thousands that are just flocking to the church. There's people coming in from other places and settling to this new religion. And Ezra Booth becomes one of those that is joining the church. So not only are the congregation leaving, but some of Sorry. Lost my train of thought really quick here. Isn't that terrible? Let's go back a step. So the people in Kirtland was not only were the congregations leaving for the church, but some of the preachers were too, like Ezra Booth, like Sidney Rigdon, and a few others that were. William McClellan was a teacher. I don't think he was a member of like a clergy, but there was prominent men as well as the regular congregation joining this church, and it must have been alarming to some people. So when Ezra Booth comes back and starts to publish things against the church, that must have been very difficult. This hasn't happened in the church yet. They've had a lot of opposition, but it's from outside and never seemed to stick very well. But here, we've got somebody that's criticizing something, even after he'd seen miracles happen. That's got to be hard, and it just seems so difficult. Maybe we'll look at Revelations in context a little. We've read some of this, so I'm not sure where we want to go with this. As you see, this is where they in 1831, there's great expectations that was given, and two of the people was Isaac Morley, who had a large farm. What I find this interesting is Isaac Morley and Ezra Booth are put together. Isaac Morley seems to be affected by Booth's negative attitude in the end. And he has to repent of different things in the scriptures, as it says, but he does. And he does everything he needs to. Well, we've got Ezra Booth, who ends up becoming just antagonistic to the church. Ever since they had first read the Book of Mormon, believers had wondered where and when the book's prophecies would be realized. When would the Lamanites, then believed to be the North American Indians, be converted and join church members in building a new Jerusalem in the Americas? These early members knew the site for the city would be among the Lamanites, and they had even dispatched Oliver Cowdery and 3 other missionaries to far western reaches of the United States to preach to the American Indian. Everything we know, I've already talked about. Now in this new revelation, the Lord declared Missouri was indeed the land which will consecrate unto my people. The land which I will consecrate unto my people. And so this is getting exciting. Everybody wants to do it. The pairs of missionaries departed for Missouri with high hopes, and they did go in pairs. Remember, they split up. They went different ways to preach the gospel on the way. Some people, like Ezra Booth, instead of doing that, try to go the land. What's interesting here is that here we've got people being faithful to that commandment. We've already talked about this, where they were out preaching the gospel. Joseph Smith was told to go straight there with Sidney Rigdon, and Morley and Booth apparently don't stop on the way to preach like they're asked to. They also decide that they're going to get to the land of Missouri. They want to see the land for themselves. And so instead of following the Lord's advice to preach along the way, they go straight there. That is the first indication that something's wrong, because they're not listening to the prophet. They're not listening to what was given. So Isaac Morley and Ezra Booth were among the missionaries called. They both attended the conference and had been ordained, and they were now designated to travel as companions. Isaac Morley had been among the first converts of the church in Ohio. At the time of his conversion, Morley and his wife Lucy, his family, and several friends lived on his farm, sharing a communal lifestyle. They were trying the best they could to live the early church, as the early Christians mentioned. Sorry, just thinking about that a little bit. So let's just read on. Ezra Booth had been a respected Methodist preacher, just as we talked about. And so him converting had been created a small stir anyway. So that in itself, like I was saying, these are people who are going, wait, what's going on here? So they're already getting stirred up. And in his mind, this is the things he wrote about this. The impressions of my mind were deep and powerful, he recalled, and my feelings were excited to a degree which I had been a stranger. But by the time of his departure in June 1831, Booth had begun to doubt. The spiritual manifestations at the conference did not meet his expectations. He was upset that Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon left for Missouri on a wagon, while he and Isaac were called to walk the entire distance in the summer heat, preaching along the way. See, the thing is there's a difference in the callings and what is expected of them, and yet they use that as a difference. It always comes down to, oh, look at what they're doing. They're doing this, and trying to nitpick at what is done. And of course they're supposed to walk the entire distance and preach along the way, and yet they decide not to. The journey was inconvenient for others as well. Joseph Smith departed just weeks after Emma lost twins shortly after birth. You would think that would, someone would think about that, but they don't. They don't realize what Joseph Smith was going through himself. He left his grieving wife, who would have to care for herself and the newly adopted Murdoch twins. whose mother Julia had died in late April, and whose father John would also make the trip to Missouri. But where is Father John doing what he's supposed to be doing? When Ezra Booth finally arrived in Missouri, he felt deflated, and he and the others expected to find a country abounding with necessities and comforts of life. Now, see the difference in this. Instead, he looked around and noted the prospect appeared somewhat gloomy, and Booth remembered Joseph Smith confidently asserting before the trip that the church in Missouri would be large and growing, but when they arrived, they found only 7 new members. Well, think about it. He had Oliver Cowdery and his company going down there. Oliver Cowdery had stopped in and preached a few months in Ohio and had just made a big stir. And look at what happened in Kirtland and how many people joined and all this other stuff. And yet their main mission was in Missouri. What would they expect? They would expect something similar or more, because now they are preaching quite a lot, and they're preaching to the Indians, and communication isn't so great that they know everything that's happening every week or every month even, and so there had to be some hope that there had been some conversions like in Kirtland, but there wasn't. So it was disappointment, yeah. As far as lands, the country being abounding with necessaries and comforts of life, that was not promised that. What was promised was Zion, and Zion is the pure in heart. Zion is not a perfect land. It never says it was. Never does. It's the people who make up Zion, not the land that is there. And we know that more and more today than ever. That we build Zion where we are, regardless of what the land's like. So you can see where their expectations were wrong. So that does not mean that he should be critical because his expectations weren't met. And we shouldn't be critical because we are disappointed in something or someone in the church. Joseph Smith himself might have been disappointed initially when he arrived in Missouri. The area around Independence was mostly open prairie and a few scattered trees, far from inspiring visions of a millennial capital and frontier town itself. And the frontier town itself was a century behind the times. That's quite a statement there, which I guess is pretty rough for that. But for most of the elders, the reality on the ground in Missouri was a disappointment, but they could deal with disappointment in different way. They would deal with disappointment in different ways. Was this really the place and time to try to build up Zion? On July 20th, anxious to understand God's timing and intentions, Joseph turned to the Lord. And when will the wilderness blossom as a rose, he prayed, and when will Zion be built up in her glory, and where will the temple stand? These questions prompted a revelation. now, Doctrine and Covenants 57, that finally designated the spot for the city and the temple. A further revelation in August 1st, Doctrine and Covenants 58, instructed missionaries to dedicate the land, but hinted that Zion would be built up only after much tribulation. We remember that. That's quite... The revelation chastised those who, like Ezra Booth, murmured complaints. They say in their hearts, this is not the work of the Lord, for his promises are not fulfilled. It warned that their reward lurketh beneath and not from above. Very powerful words. In spite of the disappointment and enormity of the city building project, Joseph was determined to make it a start. Together with Sidney Rigdon and others, he set to work. They consecrated land near Independence for a place of gathering. So we got all this. This has already happened. Some of the elders, like Reynolds Cahoon, saw exciting possibilities in these symbolic beginnings. There, my mortal eyes beheld the great and marvelous things, he wrote, such as mine eyes once never even contemplated of seeing. But Ezra Booth was unimpressed by the meager start. It was a curiosity, he said, but not worth going to Missouri to see. Though a few missionaries had been chosen to remain in Missouri, the August 1st revelation commanded the rest of the missionaries to return to their homes, indicating that the time has not yet come for many years for them to receive their inheritance in this land. Notice it says for many years, but why the journey down? So people can see what the enormity of the project is, that it wasn't something just there and simple. It was going to be complex. The Lord wasn't giving them every little thing. He wanted them to grow. Another revelation, now in Doctrine and Covenants 60, instructed the returning missionaries to travel on the Missouri River east to St. Louis. There, Joseph and Sidney Rigdon would travel speedily to Cincinnati, Ohio, to preach, while the others were to travel 2 by 2 and preach the word, not in haste, among the congregations of the wicked. They embarked in canoes in St. Louis on August 8th. The Missouri River was notoriously difficult to navigate, and we learned about all that. This is all history from what we just talked about before. Steamboat captains dreaded the sawyers, and so even the large steamboats worried about the navigation of the river. Well, they're in canoes. And Elizabeth Marsh said that the current looked mad, as if it was been cursed. The journey was a contentious one for the elders. Exhaustion, heat, and treacherous Missouri River frayed their nerves. On their third day on the water, some of the canoes nearly became entangled in the sawyers, which threatened to capsize the canoes, endangering the lives of those that could not swim. After they had made it safely to the shore, they continued bickering, though certainly capable of contention himself, Ezra Booth had little tolerance for it in others. He later observed sarcastically, "These are leaders of the church, and the only church on earth the Lord beholds in approbation." You can just see how he talks in that. So Joseph Smith receives another revelation. These are things we've already read, so it's just getting us up to date of how these scriptures are going to fit together. And the Lord warned them the danger upon the water, and said, "It mattereth not unto me whether they go by water or by land." Joseph proceeded on land the next day with a part of the group. They encountered his brother Hiram and others who had been delayed and had not yet visited the site for Zion. Why? Because they were actually doing what they're supposed to be doing, unlike Ezra Booth. A revelation admonished them to continue their journey, to assemble themselves upon the land of Zion, and hold a meeting, and rejoice together, and offer a sacrament unto the Most High. Ezra Booth, on the other hand, decided to get back as quickly as possible rather than preach by the way according to the earlier revelation. He and a few companions traveled the remainder of the journey to Ohio by boat and coach. Confound your enemies. Shortly after his return to Ohio, Ezra Booth parted ways with the church in a very public fashion. Because of it, his experience did not match his expectations of how Zion should look or how Joseph Smith should behave. He first wavered and then abandoned his faith. Beginning that October, the Ohio Star, a newspaper located in Ravenna, Ohio, began publishing a series of letters Booth penned, heavily criticizing Joseph Smith and the church. By December, his letters had even started to hinder missionary work, and Joseph Smith received two revelations. In December 1831 and January 1832, now found in Doctrine and Covenants 71 and 73. They challenged Booth and others dissidents, such as Simon's Ryder, to bring forth their strong reasons against the Lord. They also encouraged Joseph and Sidney Rigdon to preach actively. Confound your enemies, call upon them to meet you, both in public and in private. Though Sidney Rigdon challenged Booth and Ryder to public debate, they declined, and perhaps aware of Rigdon's reputation as a fierce debater, which he was. Rigdon preached in Ravenna, Ohio, and other locations, refuting Booth's claims. Although Booth's letters had a dampening effect on missionary work, the effect was short-lived. Tragically, Booth's cynicism had driven a wedge not only between him and the restored church, but also between him and his earlier spiritual experiences. He ultimately abandoned Christianity and became agnostic. So he just totally loses it. Ezra Booth's experience in traveling to Missouri turned him away from the church. Isaac Morley's ultimately drew him closer. During the trip, Morley evidently shared, at least to a degree, Ezra Booth's cynicism. A revelation received in September 11th chastised both Booth and Morley, and they condemned for evil the thing which there was no evil. Any second thoughts Morley may have had about his mission were short-lived. Unlike Ezra Booth, Isaac Morley had ceased his cynicisms and changed his outlook. The revelation continued in the Lord's own voice. I have forgiven my servant Isaac. But the Lord had additional sacrifices in mind for Isaac Morley. He was asked to relinquish his large land holdings in Kirtland and return to Missouri with his family. In a revelation given shortly after Joseph Smith's return to Kirtland, the Lord instructed Morley's brother-in-law, Titus Billings, to dispose of Morley's farm. In the revelation, given in September 11th, the Lord explained that he commanded the farm to be sold, that my servant Isaac may not be tempted above that which he is able to bear. Isaac and Lucy Morley willingly made the sacrifice. In October 1831, Titus Billings sold much of Morley's farm. Morley took his family back to independence as he was commanded and set to work once again to establish a foundation for the temple city. Having persevered through his doubts, he went on to serve as a bishop and a patriarch. He passed away in Utah in 1865. So, totally different. They started out the same. They totally went different ways. And we're going to learn more about Booth in the next few chapters as we read that these are revelations given because of how Ezra Booth acted. I think I've read way too much and kind of got lost in it a little bit, but I hope we're ready for some really interesting scriptures. It's not heavy reading this week. We do have some things, different scriptures that we can read and different talks, but overall it's a light reading this week, but I wanted to give that background so that we know what these scriptures are going through and where we're going. So we're going from the end of 1831 to the beginning of 1832. 1831 being a very eventful year, again, in the church. So these 2 years, 1830 being one that so many things happened in the church being established in April until 1831, where everything, all these things about moving to Ohio and then to Missouri as well is just amazingly a lot to take in, and somehow it's happening. And so we're finishing off 1831, going into 1832.